spend 5 delightful years in La Belle France to return without improvement in my manners. And I dare say, were I to take the hands of each and every one of you here, well, that would take up all of our time together. So suffice it to say, if you would allow, a good afternoon to you.
Miss Kim.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Jefferson.
To have the opportunity to return to this city in which I spent 20 years of my youth. My name is Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson. Oh, well, that's refreshing. No one's getting up to leave. But as you know, many would. They continue to hold differences of opinion with me. But I'd always delight to remind them they would be no more free anywhere else upon this globe to hold that difference of opinion, to express it freely, nor would I be the more free anywhere else to reply to them and to remind us all of these founding principles, to continue to remind ourselves that we are the first nation in the history of man founded upon principle, not upon royalty, nobility, landed gentry, aristocracy, special privilege. Remember? That's why we fought the war, in order to establish a government of, by, and for whom?
The people.
Oh, thank heaven you've not forgotten. And nothing could be more pleasing to me to think that the President of the United States has entered here amongst you, and you all remain seated. Oh, yes. In my opinion, that is as it ought to be. Who holds the reins of our government? You do, the people do. So never forget that. In my opinion, you ought to remain seated to your leisure, your pleasure, your comfort, while I certainly have not forgotten. It is my obligation, let alone an honorarium surely, to remain standing in your presence as a public servant. Because rest you assured, I would not be where I am, nor would any individual in our government, appointed or elected, be able to be seated without your consent, freely given and freely renewed. Citizens, I return here in your favor to reflect upon the legacy that has followed me throughout my life, the result of my 20 years here in the former capital of the old colony of Virginia, the new capital of our Commonwealth before we moved to Richmond Town. I bore witness to remarkable instances in our history. I was able to bear witness to the passing of the old regime and the implementing, if you will, as the Romans would say, of Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new world order vested in the principles of self-government. As I had retired from office, I thought perhaps to refresh my own memory that I would take pen and draft an autobiography. But in order to refresh that memory, I thought I'd better return here to Williamsburg as best I could, incognito, and visit all of those sites that truly, as I've come here, still remain vivid. And particularly to have a conversation with you all, a conversation with the people. As the Romans said, vox populi, vox dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God, and therein nature will speak. And so if you will allow me a few moments of reminiscence, I would thereby like to hear from you and discourse with you. Now, I will tell you, citizens, I was not born here. Many think I am of the Tidewater. No, my family was initially seated here. My great-great-great-grandfather was John Jefferson. He set sail from London, stepped foot on Jamestown Island in 1612.
Oh, wow.
He invested in one of the upriver plantations, Flowerdew 100, and because of the success of that investment, he was invited with another investor at Flowerdew, one Edmund Rossingham, the two of them, Jefferson and Rossingham, invited in 1619 to sail down the James River once more to Jamestown, and there that summer, that August of 1619, my great-great-great-grandfather was seated in the very first English-speaking representative form of government in the New World. He was in the very first Virginia House of Burgesses. His son, my great-great-grandfather, was Captain Samuel Jefferson, as the commission implies. He was a sea captain. He sailed the Indies, where, unfortunately, at a young age, he shed his mortal coil and passed away, was buried on the island of Nevis. He had married, however, and his eldest son was my great-grandfather, Colonel Thomas Jefferson, the elder. He was born and grew up in Henricus. He was colonel of Virginia militia, vestryman of the Church of England, a justice of the peace, and he as well was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. His son was my grandfather, Colonel Thomas Jefferson the Younger. He was born in Henricus, colonel of Virginia militia, vestryman of the Church of England, a justice of the peace, and a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. In fact, he sat in the old Capitol building, right here when the Capitol was moved up from Jamestown. That was the last year of that 17th century. And his son, my father, Colonel Peter Jefferson, was born in Henricus, colonel of Virginia militia, vestryman of the Church of England, a justice of the peace. He was one of the first 3 or 4 settlers out west. He hacked his way out of the wilderness, and there he cut a plantation that he called Shadwell. Shadwell was the little village east of London along the Whitechapel Road, where my mother, Jane Randolph, was born. And it was where her father, my grandfather, Captain Isham Randolph, was born as well. My grandfather was one of the 7 sons of the immigrants, William and Mary Randolph, who came here to Virginia. In 1660, they settled along the curls of the James River at a plantation they called Turkey Island. It was shaped like a turkey head in that vicinage. Those 7 boys married well. They had large families of their own. And it is said that there's hardly a landed family in Virginia that's unrelated to the Randolphs. William and Mary were the Adam and Eve of Virginia. Mind you, I was brought up to realize they have an ancestry, a lineage, a pedigree going all the way back through England, ultimately to Scotland, and related to Robert the Bruce, to which anyone is free to ascribe merit if you so choose. I say so because I was brought up with the respect for meritocracy, not aristocracy. And I had the opportunity to bear witness to that as a young man, because Shadwell Plantation was along the Three Chop Road. Perhaps many of you have heard of that ancient artery of commerce east-west through Virginia and west of Richmond town, as the road is no wider than about 4.5 feet, and as you venture through deep and dark forest, the trees are chopped 3 times every several miles to remind you you're on that main artery westward for the many who sought an asylum west. The many who came here to escape the ancient tumults and calumnies of European kingdoms, to ascend the eastern ranges of the Blue Ridge, and then to settle in the fertile Shenandoah Valley. I'll never forget the wagon loads of English making their way here, but equally so, wagon loads of those who had been dispossessed of their lands earlier. I'm referring to the French. I was brought up with recognition that before the English, the French claimed North America. And before the French, the Spaniards, of course, growing a great population to the west and the southwest. Through the Quebec Act, the French were allowed to return to their lands even before the English. My own father, who had invested in 5,000 acres with the Loyal Company, was not able to claim it before the French could resettle. But I also saw wagon loads of, well, many of the oppressed kingdoms of the Italies making their way here. Hebrews seeking a new promised land. Some from the kingdoms of the Orient, some from the kingdoms of the Russias. How can we forget? They were rather stubborn, do you remember? They refused to speak English. They huddled together staunchly, and have they not become most successful farmers? And citizens we know, I saw wagon loads of those who had no choice. And let us not forget that. Were not those of the kingdoms of the Africas settled here from the earliest times as well? Let us not forget the first ship-bearing Africans sailed into the Chesapeake Bay in 1690. Let alone the fact that I grew up with a people who were here long before any European arrived, amongst the Monacans of the Cherokee people. They claimed in their oral history that when their ancestors arrived, there were already a people here. Now, who were they? The point I am making, citizens, is something we ought never forget. I certainly cannot. And that is the fact that as we were growing up, governed by Great Britain, we began to realize long before the Revolution began, we are actually becoming the less and less British and the more and more
American.
Self-evident, is it not?
Yeah.
Some of you here, I dare say, are descendant of those to whom I have just now referred, but as far as I know, as I'm returning to this city, the greater majority of you have recently arrived, have you not?
Yes, very recent.
Welcome. Because rest you assured, even with my lineage as I have written, that does not make me any the more American than those of you who have just recently arrived and settled. That is who we are. It's who we have been, who we are, and who we will continue to be. It is indeed our birthright to realize that we become the more American every day. It never ends. And with a remarkable system of laws now that continues to adapt to that. Natorum habilis unto generations yet unborn. I was one of 10 children. I was the eldest son. I had 3 younger brothers. I had 6 sisters. I know, it's rather remarkable I survived. And of course, as the eldest son, I knew I would benefit from my father's estate under the English laws of primogeniture and entail. Primo first, genitor family. The eldest son of the family who would inherit directly his father's property. It would be up to me to devise unto my younger brothers. My sisters could not inherit unless they were married. And so father, recognizing that, desired me to be well educated. He placed me in an English school when I was a young boy, learning reading, writing, common arithmetic, ancient history, modern history, Latin, Greek. Then he enrolled me in a frontier academy, a classical academy, conducted by the Reverend James Murray, out on the frontier, supported through the estate of Dr. Thomas Walker. It was there I learned French and Italian, 2 of my favorite languages, particularly began to read natural philosophy, the realms of scientific investigation. I've been a student ever since. There's nothing more than science that will help to improve our lives, improve the condition of mankind. I've always believed that man and science are on a continual advance. And yet, lamentably, citizens, that year 1757, while I was at Murray's Academy, my dear father suddenly took ill and passed away. He was only 49 years old. I was only 14. Can you imagine the responsibility then upon my shoulders to be of what help I could, what support to my mother, a widow then, to preside over the rearing of 10 children? Well, I certainly knew at my majority, that is, when I would be 21 years in 1764, I would inherit over 7,000 acres, upwards of 75 enslaved. I'd have open door to Virginia gentry. I could sail the ocean and walk through the portals of nobility. Rest you assured, before my 21st birthday, I realized the greatest legacy my father left me. What do you think?
Education.
Education, very simply. Education. The greatest legacy any parent may provide their child. It returns tenfold throughout your life, more than any money may be worth later for your own happiness. Because education is not only power, education is safety, education is happiness, enlightenment. And therefore, fortunately, monies were in my father's estate that I might continue my education, and that is what brought me here. At the age of 16 years, I rode into town that winter of 59 and 60 to attend the Old Royal College of William and Mary. And as I just wrote the other day, in commencing an autobiography, it was my great and good fortune to fall under the tutelage of one Dr. William Small. Now, I doubt any of you have heard of Dr. Small. Citizens, I cannot forget him. I bring him up frequently in correspondence, let alone in confabulation, as I do today. He was my teacher. He presided over the studies of mathematics and natural philosophy. I cannot forget him. In fact, I have written accordingly. He had gentlemanly and correct manners. I can assure you, citizens, if there is anything as valuable as education throughout your life, it is very simply good manners. Good manners will return to you tenfold throughout your life. Good manners will introduce you and receive from you those whom you can trust and feel comfortable with. Romans said, manners make the man. I ask you, my fellow Americans, is that any the less important in this modern world? No. Citizens, be so bold to think upon this subject and ruminate well. The eyes of the world are upon us as to whether the American experiment in self-government will survive. They are watching us, how we treat one and the other, particularly in our diversity, because we have been the asylum of the globe. You all are testament to it. And I know what I am saying may be very well preaching to the choir, but I ask you this. We must often hear it again to remind us of what we learned when we were growing up, that we might not forget, because as the Romans said as well, man is always one generation removed from barbarism.
Oh, wow.
If he forgets, he falls backward. You know this. I teach you nothing new. But it was new when I was taught. So it is, it remains with me. The simple code of showing respect, and vouchsafe, we had great respect for Dr. Small. It was by a very simple formula. Dr. Small had great respect for whom?
You. Students.
Us, his students. He realized each and every one of us is a new mind, never seen before upon this globe, ready to be provoked in the intellect, inspired in the imagination. Secondly, as I have written about Dr. Small, he had an enlarged and a liberal mind. Oh, now I beg your pardon. I made that statement the other day. A gentleman wagged his finger at me and said, Mr. Jefferson, do not become political. I had no idea what he was referring to. I said, I beg your pardon, sir. He said, well, you mentioned the word liberal. I said, yes, sir, you heard distinctly. I hope you have not forgotten the definition of liberal. It comes from the Latin word libertas, and it means freedom. There you are, liberty, freedom, that of the human mind. The greatest vehicle of liberty and freedom and happiness any individual possesses. Not a soul can take it away from you. It is yours. You are the arbiter. You are its harbor. And it is common sense, is it not? It takes just as much energy to be happy as it does to be miserable. Dr. Small taught in the Socratic fashion to provoke us in open and free inquiry. No question was unworthy to be asked. We're a curious creature. And how are we going to know unless we ask? He provoked us to question everything, even the existence of our Creator, because He would not have it any other way. I learned young that our Creator has created our minds free, and free He desires it to remain, incapable of any temporal restraint. Reading history, we learned as youths that wherever history has shown a coercion of the law or a government to coerce people to one particular opinion over all others, that it will always result in instances of hypocrisy, meanness, and bloodshed, and be a deterrent from the plan of our holy author. If this sounds familiar with you, perhaps it is because those lines are in the very first paragraph of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom. The liberty, the right of an individual to hold their opinion upon religion as they choose, or I cannot deny, or to hold no opinion upon the subject as you choose. That still preserves, protects, and defends the liberty of the human mind. But I think evidence abounds for the existence of the omnipotent and all-powerful architect of our universe. Lastly, as I have written, Dr. Small had a happy talent for communication. He made learning a most enjoyable adventure. He helped it to understand there's great wisdom in humor. If you would allow, I will make a short divergence. You know, as I dismounted a short distance from here, I took off my riding boots, I dusted myself off, and I wondered whether you might observe me to be not only musty-dusty from the saddle, but perhaps peculiarly apparelled. Conjured up an apology until I ventured down here and began to look amongst you and wondered, why should I apologize for the way I'm attired here today? I always believed in dressing for comfort, but you overwhelm me in that regard. And here I feel I'm the overdressed, and I beg pardon for that. But then, of course, this is not what I wore when I was a young student here attending William and Mary, and that is quite obvious, is it not? Fashions and styles change one generation after the next. That is part of our continued pursuit of comfort and happiness and liberty. So I hope some of you have read, as I have written, in matters of style, simply swim with the current. But in matters of principle, stand like a rock. And therefore, for the utilizing of humor, the principle very simply is the necessity of an educated citizen body if we are to prove successful in holding the reins of self-government. I left the tutelage of Dr. Small after 2 years. Then he asked me what degree I had received. Well, I fess up to you, I received no degree. A baccalaureate was not offered until 10 years later, so truthfully, I did not graduate from college, which I suppose may suit me well to found a university, does it not? It does, citizens, it does. The tutelage, the education that I had at William and Mary has suited me well. It has remained with me my entire life. And I have written many times, perhaps more than any other, Dr. Small fixed my destiny. Maybe many of you remember a teacher in your own life who has been of as great an influence and has remained with you accordingly, to bear an open mind for what tomorrow may bring. I began reading law with Mr. George Wythe here in this city. I only took a student for a period of 3 years at the time. And I learned two things most fundamental in law. The Old English common law, which we have inherited as the foundation of our jurisprudence, our Constitution. First and foremost, I learned that English law and our law is well grounded in the Justinian Code of Law, the first civil body of law provided for civilized man, not yesterday, not 100, 200 years today, citizens, lest we forget, the 6th century, by Roman Emperor Justinian I. And the foundation of the Justinian Code, everyone is born free. Everyone comes into this world with a right to their own person and to move wherever they choose to improve their condition. Now, grant you, that was nearly forgotten through the ages of the darkest ignorance. Had it not been for many a monk, many a scribe in their dark cells through the flick of a candlelight that were able to transcribe that wisdom of the ancient world, that the modern world might realize the past was not less intelligent than we are today. They simply had not discovered that further frontier of knowledge. They had not taken more boldly that step into their future, which is now our present. Thank heaven, this wisdom of the past was kept alive for that precious invention of this modern world, the printing press. To disseminate that information to the greatest extent, provoking people to want to read. And what happens when an individual begins to read for themselves? They begin to, there you are, they begin to think for themselves. You think any medieval monarch or ecclesiastic wanted their subjects or their congregations to learn to read for themselves and begin to think for themselves, and to later realize that there was a distant land where they might become master of their own destiny? To pursue happiness, that they have an inherent right thereby, under the laws of nature, nature's God, to be happy? Thank heaven for those monks. Thank heaven for those scribes. Gentlemen, lest we forget, that is why we are wont to recite, are we not, in our lodges, light and liberty go together. The second thing I learned during the 3 years reading law with Mr. Wythe was very simply, laws are living and breathing. They grow, they evolve one generation after the next. They have to. This is common sense. If this were the time that I was reading law with Mr. Wythe, imagine the number of you who would be approached by the constable, either fined or thrown into jail for appearing in their underclothes, or women in pantaloons. Again, citizens, this is common sense. Perhaps some of you have read, as I have written, a child of 14 cannot wear the same clothes at the age of 40. Our laws and institutions grow as we grow as a people. I took leave after being licensed to practice the law, practicing law for 7 years here in the former colony of Virginia. 7 years, only 7 years, because in 74, recall, the monarchy closed down the courts of justice here in the colonies. I've referred to that in our Declaration of American Independence. It's one of the grievances, lest we forget. He has made his judges dependent upon his will alone. Let us not forget. I certainly have not. But fortunately, I have been elected to public office. During that time, I became more interested and more attentive to the legislative process where the laws are made. Mr. Witt continued to teach law. He had many other students, one of them my second cousin. You've heard of him, John Marshall, our Chief Justice. As you perhaps know, no two gentlemen could have more of a difference of opinion in the law than Justice Marshall and myself. But that's a testament to Mr. Witt teaching the foundation, the integrity of the law, recognizing every generation is welcome to argue and debate it. However, lest we forget in our nation, the ultimate jury is whom? The people. The people where the law is made. The legislative body. Now please remind Justice Marshall of that. Well, he's come up with this idea of judicial review. Now think of this for a time. The people, through their representatives, create the laws, it become law, and then those of appointment decide, no, this is not a law. This is not worthy. We need to continue to converse upon this and discuss this. And Marshall knows that. That was part of what we learned under the tutelage of Mr. Witt. Mr. Witt was my mentor in many ways, my friend of all hours. I mentioned I was elected to public office, and indeed, when I was 26 years old, still practicing law, I took my seat in the old House of Burgesses right yonder in that building, the spring of 1769, and I will, well, the old-timers will never forget how presumptuous I was that very first day I held public office. I had no idea it would be the beginning of 40 years in public service. And once I was recognized, I immediately called for the permission, merely the permission, to begin a debate towards ending the importation of slaves to Virginia. How do you think that went over? Many of the Tidewater gentry called out, "Who is this upstart from the wilderness? Who is this turncoat unto his own class?" Well, as you know, I've never let them down, have I? And I continued with this. Who knows better than one who has been born into this abominable practice among so-called civilized man? We know this in our heart and our conscience. Our God is a just God, is he not? He cannot but abhor the institution of slavery. And when do we begin to tremble in recognition his justice will not sleep forever? That is why I know, despite the heresies hurled against me, that there is an exalted bench in heaven that awaits me. For nothing is more assuredly written in the book of faith than these people ought to be free. I was approached by my cousin, Mr. Peyton Randall, Speaker of the House of Burgesses. Oh, he admonished me. He said, "Cousin, that is not how you will win friends or be of any great influence. Please approach this with reason, with baby steps, one-on-one with the individual. Utilize reason to help another individual recognize how this will benefit them, their children, those yet born. Recognize, if you will, common sense upon the subject. We can no longer continue as our population of enslaved grows more than 50% of the population. How much longer are we going to continue to support a system of labor? This is not only morally wrong, it will ultimately implode our political economy." He said, "And bear up, because you will not only always be successful, but bear up and realize in common sense error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. For he who gave us common sense gave us reason as well." Mr. Peyton Randolph never lived to see me take up the pen in Philadelphia, though he was the one to call for an American Congress, midway between the North and the South, in that city of toleration, enlightenment, and education. But Cousin Peyton would have well understood everything in our Declaration of American Independence, as so many did. It's common sense, and it's nothing new or original. It's all been written before, all been argued and debated before. You may find it in the elementary books of public right, the works of Aristotle, Cicero, Algernon Sidney, John Locke. Those authors, their works, each and every one of you have read and reread frequently, do you not?
Yeah.
No, you do not. I know you do not. Not when we remember in 1776, many Americans could not even, and there you are. And so it was my obligation, my responsibility when I took up the pen to shed the lofty sophisms of these ancient authors, explain it in clear and simple terms, place before the world the common sense of the matter, and that matter simply that our American Revolution was being fought on behalf of the common man, to provide the greatest good for the greatest number, to show the rest of the world that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a few booted and spurred ready to ride them. But the man holds an inalienable right in nature to cast off the monkish chains of ignorance and grasp the reins of self-government. I hope indeed you've all heard or read that before, because that is our founding principle more than anything else. That enables us. His Excellency, our first President, General George Washington, referred to our Declaration of American Independence as our promise. He referred to our Constitution as its guarantee. I thank you for listening to these reflections, these reminiscences, and I should like to hear your questions, but I share this one last thing. You know, as I took up the pen the other evening to continue my autobiography, something came to mind after several days' perambulation about this city. Something that I realized had influenced me more than anything else during those 20 years that I have continued to bring with me through life. And so I share that sentence with you. Quote, at the age of 14, being thrown out into the world without a member of my family fit to guide me, it is a wonder that I did not fall off into bad company. But I had before me my father's good friends, Dr. William Small, Mr. George Wythe, and Mr. Peyton Randall. And whenever I found myself in a situation in which I did not know how to proceed, well, I observed their conduct. I listened to their conversation, and I conducted myself accordingly. Through no element of reasoning, I was a young boy, 14 years of age, to know how to reason properly. As I have written, through no element of reasoning, simply through imitation alone. End quote. You now understand more vividly that legacy that has remained with me after the 20 years I was privileged to bear witness to remarkable times in our history. What do you think it is? Very simple. Good manners. Manners make the man. Rest assured that will never be the least important in the future. It fell upon my desk to remove our capital during the war. I was the last resident of the governor's palace. And I have written, Williamsburg, however, will remain a capital of hospitality, a capital of education, and a capital of good manners. Citizens, I thank you for these moments. As I promised earlier, I welcome any question and curiosity you may have. So you've been kind to provide me.
What is your relationship with the former president, John Adams?
My relationship with Mr. Adams has been good over the last several years. I'm afraid that back in about, back when I lost that presidential election of 1796, as was written in our Constitution, whoever receives the second highest number of votes thereby becomes vice president. And so I had to suffer that office for a good 4 years. As I have said, the mind of man never conjured up a more useless office than that of vice president. And thank heaven we rectified that in the 12th Amendment that passed in 1804, and thereby had the first vice presidential election. But I was not a silent vice president by any means. And therefore I continued to argue, and that's perhaps the reason why 4 years later, in 1800, I was invited to stand a second time for the office of president. The president's own vice president contesting him, but our nation was so divided, so rife with vitriol, that we were not alone. There were two others who divided that campaign, and therefore it resulted finally in a tie, and not between President Adams, but between two opposed to President Adams, 73 electoral votes each for Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson. And for many days, the United States of America did not know who would be the next president. Mercy. Can you ever imagine such a thing happening in our history? Again, citizens, it was certain that Mr. Adams would not have a second term. I certainly did not forget my manners, and I sought to pay my respects. And I worried about it, sir. I worried if I were too immediate, it would show me overzealous. I worried if I took my time, it would show me uncaring. And so it was that I ventured to meet him when I thought appropriate. He, the first resident in the new president's house, he shook my hand in my particular method. His method has always been somewhat of a monarchical bow. And we sat and we had a confab for several hours. And we realized two things, citizens. That no disagreement between two friends in either religion or politics should come between them and break their friendship. If it does, there's simply never been a friendship to begin with. It's all been pursued upon advantage. The second thing we realized was how divisive the nation had become, that New England was seeking an opportunity to leave the Union. Do you remember that? Citing the American practice of slavery in the South as immoral. Mr. Adams and I pondered that for a time, and we both realized something that I hope we never forget. And that is simply that we had shown the rest of the world, who referred to us as a radical rabble in the hinterlands of North America, that we were a most civilized people in our diversity, who succeeded in bringing together 13 individual nations. Remember that? Each one of those former colonies, distant, disparate from one and the other, in the degree of religious opinion in one versus a vast difference in another, in the degree of freeholders in one versus the greater number of tenants upon the freeholdings in another. We brought it all together, e pluribus unum, through a founding principle, again, never to be forgotten, compromise and resolution on behalf of the common good. Mr. Adams said to me, well, Mr. Jefferson, suppose we allow then New England to secede. Will that end the argument? No. Of course not. These are ancient arguments. They have existed from time immemorial, and we could no longer blame them on England. They were ours, right at the very center of the dichotomy of human nature. And I replied, well, Mr. President, the argument indeed would continue, and it would fester because we'd set a precedence. We had shown the rest of the world then the American experiment in self-government had failed. And so that would receive energy then, and the argument might continue between North Carolina and Virginia. And provided that energy and precedence, well then look what would happen. North Carolina and Virginia would perhaps secede one from the other. Would that end the argument? No, it would just apply a greater energy. To which I replied, Mr. President, that argument then might continue within the old Dominion.
Jeez.
And Virginia might implode upon itself. So I think we ought to continue to bear mind, as President Adams and I certainly realized upon that occasion, in political vitriol and contest, that it is the principles over which we shed our blood in the American Revolution that should remain our greatest strength. 2 heads are better than 1, 3 heads better than 2, 13 heads and more. How beneficial that is, truly, for the common good of everyone. Other curiosities, yes, sir. How many children do I have? Well, sir, Mrs. Jefferson bore 6 children. I'm happy to say, unfortunately, we could not understand why her health was compromised. During childbirth, she craved sugar more than usual, and our babies were born the heavier. Our last child, a little girl, Lucy Elizabeth, weighed 12 pounds. Whoa. Mrs. Jefferson did not recover, sir. Not before I promised her I could not marry again, and I've held to that promise, you may know. And I will tell you, sir, Mrs. Jefferson then did not have to live and bear witness, as I have, to the death of 5 of our 6 children. As I have written, the happiness of my autumn years rests upon the slender thread of my dear daughter Martha alone, and perhaps even that cord a parental pleasure may be severed me. And I've written, sir, we must not mumble and grumble about things in our own life, because we must stand a moment and realize it's always worse for someone somewhere. And does that not bind us the more together as a family of man? I hope you have not forgotten your manners. Next question. Yes, sir.
What went into the thought of where you have built your home? Was that land that you already owned, or did you seek it out for its space?
Are you referring to what I refer to often as my mountain area, Monticello, which in Italian, of course, means just what it is. You probably know. Mont means mountain. Cello, the beautiful instrument, as we name so in Italian, in its own identity. The cello is smaller than a bass, and therefore it is the small mountain upon which I reside. It's my inheritance. That was purchased by my father, Colonel Peter Jefferson. In fact, it is believed it was won in a game of chance in Mr. Southall's Raleigh Tavern. He owned the Raleigh at that time in the mid-1730s, and they could not write in the deed that it was won in a game of chance. So the deed, which is still extant in the courthouse in Albemarle, states clearly, Colonel Peter Jefferson procures from Colonel William Randolph 400 acres, including 3 little mountains in what was still then Goochland County, for 1 bowl of Henry Weatherburn's Arrack Punch.
Oh my gosh.
When I was growing up, you could not walk out of the front door of Shadworth House without seeing directly the little mountain in the distance, about 2 miles. It always beckoned me to scale it, and of course Father had already cultivated the top of that mountain, so I would always seek an asylum up there, and that is what I later secured when I built a hermitage, a little brick cottage, 1 room that had served me as my bedchamber, kitchen, hall, study, cabinet as well. Of course, when I was married with Mrs. Jefferson, that is where I took my new bride, where we began our family, and it became known as our honeymoon cottage. So that is, if you will, the delineation of its particular history. Yes, sir. Yes.
Are you acquainted with the Reverend John Witherspoon?
Oh, yes, of course. I've known him of the Presbyterian College up in Princetown, New Jersey. He was amongst the delegates there, and that was Continental Congress, a man of great wisdom, a man of great benevolence, a man most appropriately, I think, in his benevolence and wisdom, representative of the true tenets of William Tennent and many others who preached in the Presbyterian faith. I certainly admire him. I admire that Presbyterian College in Princetown. I admire many that have followed him, particularly the Reverend Ashbel Green in Philadelphia, who presided over the Second Presbyterian Church there, 4th and Cherry Street, well familiar with many of the congregants in that church. So, yes, sir, I know well of whom you are referring. No less, as we've become known, a founding father in our nation. Yes, dear.
Talk about how you met and married your wife.
How I met and married Mrs. Jefferson? Yes, madam, I'm very succinctly, I rarely speak about her, and even less so to write about her, but no, I will never forget when I rode into town that winter of 59 and 60, I first set eyes on Miss Martha Wales. She was the eldest of the 4 daughters of Mr. John Wales, who resided out in Charles City County upon his plantation known as the Forest. She was quite adept at the spinet, and I can tell you many gentlemen gathered around that instrument when she would attend a musicale. One of them was the more successful, and that was Mr. Bathurst Skelton. And so they were married, but unfortunately, 2 years into the marriage, Bat was killed in a carriage accident out on the Jamestown Road. So the widow Skelton went into a widow's seclusion, usually at the time about 2 years. But I remember distinctly, after about a year and a half, I was riding down the Duke of Gloucester Street. I heard the most melodious sound of a spinet coming out of a parlor window. But I recognized the melody. In fact, so did my horse. He perked up his ears, took me swiftly in that direction. When we arrived, I dismounted, went up onto the porch, and there was the delicate figure of the widow Skelton seated at the spinet. Well, I knew then she may be coming out of her seclusion, so I made a rap on the door. The servant girl attended, and I asked if if the widow Skelton would join Mr. Jefferson to accompany her. She went in, returned to the affirmative, she'd be delighted. So I ran to my horse satchel and I snatched my kit. Sir, are you familiar with a kit? Do you know what a kit is? A kit?
Can't say as I do.
No? Well, sir, it is a miniature violin. It's only about that long. It's half the size in its width. It's what the music makers carry about in their pockets when they go about to teach music and dance. And it is what every gentleman ought to realize is its greatest virtue. That is its portability. You can carry it about in your pockets, so it's always ready for those immediate moments of romance. I brought my kit in, and the widow Skelton and I enjoyed an hour's musicale. It was certain, as we adjourned, that she had accepted my courtship. And as I took leave, the same servant girl, upon handing me my hat, said, Mr. Jefferson, you might be the more delighted to know that during your musicale, at the time that you desisted in your accompaniment, the widow proceeded in a solo. I was gazing out the window, and I saw two gentlemen riding in this direction. When the oddest thing occurred, the ears of the horses perked up, taking them swiftly to the porch. They jumped off, same time, ran up onto the porch to knock on the door at the same time. When it was then, the music of your kit was heard conjoined with the music of the spinet. The other gentleman looked to the one as he lowered his hand and said, we're too late. Jefferson's gotten here before us. It's a true story, I'm happy to relate. It was brought down through my family, and as a consequence, we caught it predominantly here in this city. For about a year and a half, we were married on the first of the year, 1772, out at her father's plantation, the forest. I remember the ceremony was only about 10 minutes. You remember the Church of England, marry, start a family as soon as possible. And the revelry, however, went on for 2 weeks. And at the end of January, I hitched up my phaeton so that my bride and I could embark westward and I might introduce her to my mountaineering. After the first day's ride, we found ourselves caught in a snowstorm. We had no idea. This would be the largest blizzard yet recorded in Virginia history. At the end of the second day, the snows were 4 feet deep.
Oh, wow.
We had to abandon the phaeton at Cousin Carter's plantation at Blenheim. We made the rest of our way over to the mountain on horseback, arrived nigh midnight. We tethered the horses in a shed below, and we walked the rest of the way up. Can you imagine, over the threshold of my hermitage, I brought my new bride. So very cold, I went immediately to make a fire. She busied herself amongst my books, and suddenly I heard her let out an exclamation. And here she had discovered a bottle of French wine hidden behind my law books. And I dare say next to that warm fire and that bottle of French, I beg your pardon, madam. Suffice it to say, the next morning we used that empty bottle of wine to rechristen my hermitage as our honeymoon cottage. So I thank you for those most delightful and deeply heartfelt reminiscences. Citizens, I must take my leave at present. I continue my journey here about town, and I cannot help but think it must have been a curiosity for you to sit there and to gaze upon the past. But think of the greater delight that I have had to stand before you and gaze upon the future. Perhaps some of you have read as I have written. I do enjoy the dreams of the future better than the history of the past. I remain your humble and obedient servant, Thomas Jefferson. Godspeed. Sell the produce at market, they make the money. I have built a nailery at Monticello. It's operated by the young enslaved boys. They make the product, they sell the money, sell the nails, they make the money. Although we have a terrible competition with the nailery at the prison, they may have opportunity to purchase their liberty from my creditors. And I'm not the only one. This is quite the scene amongst all of my neighbors. Give it back to us. I'm perhaps the only one who is smoking alcohol in the city.
I don't want to get into someone else's picture.
No, and that's why I received so much heresy from those who say that red-breeched radical revolutionary Jefferson was trying to extricate my rightful property.
Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure. In fact, someone told me the other day, as we think upon this matter, and how can we speak what we speak, and yet continue in the habits and customs. Someone told me in the future, they said, good heavens, 2 centuries from now, that a people ought to contemplate in their particular time if they, well, I might ask you, do you enjoy sugar?
Of course.
Do you wear cotton?
When I can get it.
Yes, so
In
you
the
are
summer.
supporting over 27 million enslaved.
But this is these are men and women.
That's exactly what I'm
in their own
saying.
home.
That's exactly what I'm saying. You're supporting over 27 million in the modern world, they tell me, enslaved. Who's saying anything about it? I still am.